This podfic contains content that may be disturbing for some viewers, including mentions of violence, guns, and physical and emotional abuse. Please check out the complete list of content warnings in the description, and proceed with caution if you are sensitive to these topics. Hello, my lovely little gemstones, it's Afira, and today I'll be reading When the Chips Are Down by Whiskey with Patron. Chapter 6. We accidentally break into a stranger's house. Patton decided he hated cops. Granted, this small car chase hadn't amounted to much. The police car chasing them hadn't been able to keep up, and Remy had taken a detour down another road to ensure that they'd thrown her off their trail. But still, it was nerve-wracking as heck. He had no idea Rathsblade had people inside the justice system. Now they were cruising along at a speed that wouldn't get them immediately pulled over, and Patton was eternally grateful that Remy had slowed down. He couldn't help but get anxious over the possibility of crashing and dying. Death was the thing Patton was trying to avoid at the present moment. Gosh, this was more stressful than the Poison Dart Massacre of 2010. Well, maybe not quite. 2010 had been a very stressful year. He held tight to Remy as they zipped along the highway towards the city. Patton knew Rathsblade wasn't just limited to their home city, Clawmore, but no one would be expecting him to be here in Sidehill instead. He hoped that would be enough to throw them off his trail for now. He gazed around as buildings came into view, along with more roads. He didn't know where Remy was going to take them, but he trusted Remy to get them somewhere safe. Patton couldn't help but glance through the windows of every car they passed as they drove along the road. Anyone could be from Rath. Anyone could be chasing them. He shook his head. He needed to stop being so paranoid. Remy turned down a different street. Patton wondered what Remy's friend Andy would be like. He hoped she wasn't too involved in illegal affairs. The last thing Patton needed was more police on his tail. Actually, now that Patton thought about it, he had never heard of Remy having a friend named Andy before. He wondered why Remy had never told him about her before. Maybe it was because Andy was involved in illegal stuff. Patton could understand that. Patton kept his own illegal habits a secret from Remy for years back when they first became friends. Patton kept his shoulders tensed as they got into a more populated area of the city. They emerged on a street lined with stores and buildings. Patton kept his eyes out for anyone wearing orange. It was an uncommon color to wear casually, so it was entirely possible that anyone wearing it could be after him. "So, Remy," he said, now that they were going at a much slower pace in the middle of traffic. Patton hoped it was easier for Remy to hear him through the helmet. "Where is this friend of yours?" Remy shrugged as they slowed to a stop at a traffic light. "She's always changing her address. Makes it harder for people to track her down. I actually think she sold her apartment a couple months ago. Not sure." Patton blinked. "So, you don't know where she is?" "Well, she definitely knows where we are. She doesn't like to be found easily, though. She's probably gonna mess with us." "Mess with us? How?" Remy shrugged. "Dunno. I'll know it when I see it." Patton didn't really like the sound of that. What was this Andy woman going to do? And how did she know where they were? They followed the flow of traffic. Nothing seemed too out of the ordinary so far, but he still couldn't force himself to relax. He needed to stay on his toes if he would have any chance of staying away from Rath. Patton yelped when Remy suddenly took a sharp turn down another street, earning some angry honking from the drivers around them. "Where are we going?" he asked. Remy gestured with one hand to something far ahead of them. Patton squinted at where he pointed. He spotted an electric billboard amongst the buildings. Words flashed across it over a black background. Patton made out the words, "Follow the trail," before the screen flickered to an advertisement for a hotel. "What's going on?" Patton asked. "Where are we going? What are we doing?" Remy's knuckles were white on the handles of his motorbike. "Following the trail." Patton had 1,000 questions, but asking them might just raise more. He opted to stay quiet while Remy drove them through the city. He would save his questions for later, when Remy wasn't so focused on the task at hand, whatever that task was. He furrowed his brow when Remy pulled over into the parking lot of a hotel. "Is this where she is?" Remy parked the motorcycle and stood. "Nope. Just picking up the next breadcrumb in the trail." He took off his helmet and narrowed his eyes at the door. "Do I go in?" he whispered. Patton shrugged. He had no idea what was going on. He just sat back and listened to the music someone was playing from their car in the parking lot. He glanced in their direction. The person was sitting in the driver's seat and scrolling through their phone, probably waiting for their spouse or friend to leave the hotel, or waiting for someone else to arrive. He jumped when the music volume spiked. It took Patton a moment to notice the song had changed as well. The lyrics were vulgar and obscene, and Patton almost wanted to cover his ears at the sound of it. The person in the car had a look of confusion on their face. They hit all the buttons on their radio and turned their volume dial, but nothing changed. Patton couldn't help but listen to some of the words of the song, considering the sheer volume. "Good times on Front Street," the radio sang, accompanied by a jazzy piano instrumental. The song dissolved into senseless noise, and when the person hit another button on their radio, it turned back to a fun pop song. They turned the volume down and rolled up their window with an embarrassed blush on their cheeks. Remy stared at it. "Front Street," he muttered. He pulled out his phone. "Does this city have a Front Street?" After a moment of typing and scrolling, Remy shoved his phone back into his pocket and grabbed his helmet. He sat on the bike and barely waited for Patton to wrap his arms around his waist before he pulled out of the parking lot and zipped back onto the street. Patton was mildly confused as to what was going on, but he trusted Remy to get them to where they needed to go. He just held on to Remy and kept his eyes out for any signs of someone following them. They seemed safe for now, but anyone could be an enemy. Remy turned down another street and slowed down. He pulled over and parked next to the sidewalk. Patton's confusion only grew when Remy turned to Patton to ask a question. "What other lyrics did that song say? Did you hear any of it?" Patton blinked. "The song the person in the car was listening to?" "Yeah. Do you remember what else it was about?" Patton racked his brain. I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was vulgar. There was something about drinking or drugs. I don't really know. I think it was drinking." Remy glanced around the street. "Drinking, drugs. Is there a bar anywhere around here?" Patton crossed his arms and gave Remy his best disapproving dad glare. "Remy, we are not drinking. It's hardly after lunchtime." "No, I don't want to drink. I'm just following Andy's trail." His gaze slid across something a ways down the sidewalk. "There's a bar." Patton furrowed his brow. "Why is that important?" Remy stared at the bar he'd seen down the sidewalk. Patton followed his gaze. The neon sign above the bar blinked on and off. Patton squinted at it. It was flashing in a repeating pattern. Was that Morse code? Remy gazed intently at the neon sign. "This fucker wants me to go where?" he whispered. He stared at the sign for another minute, then heaved a sigh. "Looks like we're stopping at the nearest Walmart." As Remy revved the motorcycle and pulled back into traffic, Patton only came up with more and more questions. What was this wild goose chase they were being sent on for? Was this a normal occurrence when Remy wanted to visit his friend Andy? Why was Andy doing this? However, he tried to remain patient as they drove through the streets. He wasn't sure what all of this was about, but he hoped they would be able to find out soon. He was anxious out of his mind, and being confused was certainly not helping the situation. Remy turned down another street. A Walmart came into view, and Patton couldn't resist asking the question while they entered the parking lot. "Why are we here?" Remy pulled into a parking spot and parked the bike. "Because Andy's an asshole," he grumbled as he pulled off his helmet. "You're coming in with me. You shouldn't be alone out here." Patton wasn't about to argue with that. He pulled his own helmet off, his curly brown hair falling around his face in a disheveled mess. He took his glasses off his shirt collar and shoved them on his face, while Remy did the same with his sunglasses. Patton gave a cautious glance around the parking lot, as did Remy, before they walked side by side towards the Walmart. No one in the crowd around them looked suspicious, but Patton still kept his guard up. He clutched the straps of his backpack, trying to ease his nerves. Remy entered the store first, and Patton hurried after him. Remy passed right by the carts and the shopping baskets, making a beeline for a chip display. He grabbed 2 bags of Doritos and turned towards the checkout. Patton quickened his pace so he matched Remy's speed. "Why are we buying chips?" "Because the asshole wants chips," Remy answered bitterly. He went for the self-checkout. Patton followed, still feeling a bit lost. Remy tapped his foot impatiently as they waited in line. Patton had only ever seen him as cocky, fun-loving, and wild. This impatient, frustrated, and focused Remy was a little strange to see. Maybe Remy was worried about his friend Andy. Maybe he just wanted to get somewhere safe as soon as possible. Patton didn't know. They reached the till and Remy put the 2 bags of chips through. However, Patton was staring at the screen over his shoulder, and for some reason, a third item appeared on the screen, except it didn't describe any kind of merchandise, and the price next to it amounted to $0. The text of the third item just read, 30 Side Street. "That's an address," Patton realized. Remy nodded. "Yep." He shoved the chips into the plastic bag of snacks they still had from the gas station. "Let's hope that's our final destination. I don't want to play this game for the next 2 hours. He tapped his debit card against the machine and strode towards the door as soon as it beeped. The thought crossed Patton's mind that maybe going through a different till and paying in cash would have been better. Cards could leave a paper trail after all. However, he just patiently waited for the receipt to print. He took it from the machine and scurried after Remy. "So, what is all of this?" Patton decided to ask as soon as they were outside. "Is this just to meet Andy? Why is she sending us on this wild goose chase around the city?" "She just does that," Remy sighed. "She doesn't want anyone else to find out where she is, except for us, and she doesn't want to text me the address because I could get hacked or something. Besides, I think she just likes fucking with me." Patton considered all the strange things that had happened so far. The billboard with the strange message, the radio in that person's car at the hotel, the flashing neon sign over the bar, and now the text at the checkout screen. Was Andy doing all of that? Remy gave a curt nod. She's a talented bastard. The asshole can hijack anything. Radio signals, screens, lights. She could probably cause a citywide blackout if she wanted. It's a wonder she hasn't done that yet. Patton took a couple seconds to process that information as Remy shoved his helmet back on. This Andy lady sounded dangerous. If she could control that many things and in such a short time, what would be keeping her from getting a hold of Patton's personal information and selling it off to Wrath's blade? If they knew his location, they would be on him like moths to a lamp. Remy held up Patton's helmet. Come on, we don't have all day. Patton took off his glasses and put on his helmet. He sat behind Remy and wrapped his arms around his waist, hoping Remy wouldn't go zipping through the city like a madman. Luckily, Remy backed out of the parking spot at a normal speed. It's a short drive from here, he said. Your anxiety going to be able to hold out until then? Patton wasn't sure how to answer that question. Yeah, he decided eventually. He let his mind wander as they rode through the city. He hoped Virgil and the twins managed to find their way to Janus without too much trouble. If they'd been followed and cornered somewhere... No, he couldn't think like that. They made it. They had to have made it to Janus. He wanted to call them, or at least text to see if they were alive, but he couldn't risk them being traced back to him. Contacting them would only put them in more danger than they were already in. Would the kids being there put Janus in danger too? Patton hadn't thought so, considering Janus's more legal career choices, but what if Wrath decided to attack Chimera to get the kids so they could get to Patton? Even worse, there was always a possibility that if Wrath knew Chimera was housing the kids of Patton, who was very high up on their shit list, they might try to barter with Chimera for the kids. Patton could only hope that Janus's morals were consistent and that he wouldn't sell Patton's kids to another gang for the right amount of money. Despite his concerns, Patton did trust him. Janus may not have been the most honest person in the world, but he was always true to his word. He promised he would repay Patton someday, and today was that day. Janus would protect the kids. We're here. Patton blinked and looked around. He hadn't noticed that they'd entered a neighborhood. It was a quaint street lined with houses, which reminded Patton too much of his own home with his kids. They had parked in front of a nice 2-story house with white siding. Remy stood. Come on, I think this is our last stop. Patton stood with him. They both tugged off their helmets as they walked up the driveway towards the door. The hair on the back of Patton's neck stood on end, and his instincts were screaming at him to run, but he ignored that and just followed Remy to the house. Everything would be fine. He trusted Remy. Remy didn't bother to knock. He just opened the door and walked right in. Patton wanted to tell Remy that maybe breaking in wasn't the best idea. Last time Patton had broken into a house, it hadn't ended well for the people who lived in the house. But Remy didn't play by other people's rules. If he wanted to walk right into a stranger's house, he was going to walk right into a stranger's house. Patton hesitantly followed him. They emerged in a small kitchen. Just ahead was a living room with a set of blinds covering the far wall, and to the right was a hallway. It looked like a nice place. Did you bring my stuff? Patton shrieked in fear at the sudden voice. Remy, however, didn't even flinch. Yeah, I got your shit. He walked towards the living room, pulling out the 2 bags of Doritos he'd bought. He tossed them on the couch. Sweet, said the new voice. A dark hand snatched up one of the bags, and Patton heard the person rip it open. Remy looked at Patton and gestured to the couch. This is Andy. Patton stepped past the kitchen counter and peered down. A woman with brown skin lounged on the couch, her form lost in a mess of black fabric that made up a t-shirt and a baggy hoodie. Her short black hair fell over her face in messy bangs. A laptop sat on the couch next to her. Patton blinked, a little surprised. He'd expected someone who looked a little more dangerous. This lady reminded him more of Virgil, with her whole emo aesthetic, except this woman's look was more lazy than deliberately edgy. She even looked about as young as Virgil, too, but Patton doubted she was any younger than 19. No one that young could cause the kind of havoc Remy claimed Andy was capable of. It's nice to meet you, Patton said. Remy told me about you. And the stuff you can do, Remy added. Listen, Patton's in some shit with Wrath, and we need somewhere to stay. How much will it take for you to get us a couple of fake IDs? Andy paused just before she could shove a Dorito into her mouth. She looked Patton up and down and raised an eyebrow. The dad in the double denim, a cat hoodie, and an elementary student's backpack is in deep shit with Wrath's blade. She turned back to Remy. You're fucking with me, right? Unfortunately, no, Remy said. Andy snorted. Damn, dude, what the hell did you do? Patton's shoulders tensed automatically. He didn't want to share. It wasn't something he liked to think about.
Let's just say I'm very, very high up on their list of people they hate, Patton said. Like, so high up, I pulled the favor with a leader of an underground crime ring so he would take care of my kids and keep them safe so Wrath doesn't kidnap them to get to me. Andy stared at him for a solid 10 seconds. No fucking way. She grabbed her laptop off the couch and clicked a few things. She turned it around and held it up so Patton could see. These your kids? Patton looked at the screen, and a feeling of overwhelming relief washed over him. On screen was footage from a security camera inside Chimera Bank, the location back in Clawmore. He recognized Virgil's outlandish fashion sense and Remus's limp right away. His kiddos had made it safely to Chimera. Is that footage recent? He asked. Are they okay? Are they still in there? Andy set the laptop back down and held up a hand. Whoa there, Padre. You two are asking for two very different tasks here. She pointed to Remy. He wants some new identities so you guys can hide out somewhere. She pointed to Patton. And you want to see if your babies are still alive. Those are some pretty tall orders, and I don't exactly give out my services for free. How much? Patton demanded. At the moment, knowing if his kids were okay was more important than making sure he was safe himself. Remy sighed. Come on, man. Andy shook her head. Look, dude, I gotta make a living. I can't just do all this shit for free. It's gonna cost you. Remy lowered his sunglasses to stare at Andy. I bought you Doritos. Andy glanced down at the chip bags. She scratched the back of her neck and bit her lip as if she was thinking. Yeah, She heaved a laborious sigh. Fine. If you guys can bring me a couple cans of Red Bull, I'll consider us even. But only 'cause I like you, Padre. You're dealing with two of the most dangerous gangs in the US of A. You've got balls. Patton wasn't sure what to do with that compliment. That is an unorthodox way of saying I have courage, but I'll take it. Andy turned back to her computer. That footage I showed you was from 10 minutes ago. Your kids left a building and didn't come back. Patton cursed in his head. The teller must not have let them in to see Janus. That wasn't a surprise. He'd hoped they'd managed to follow Patton's instructions to get inside Chimera. Can you by any chance get into the cameras underground? Patton asked. Andy furrowed her brow and shoved a couple Doritos in her mouth. Dunno, she mumbled through her food. I mean, I can, but Chimera might kick my ass if they found out I'd been poking around in their stuff. Will they find out? Remy asked. Andy scoffed. Unlikely. Hang on, I've already got a loophole into their cameras. Patton watched with bated breath as Andy clicked on a few things. She turned the laptop around for Patton to see. Here they are now. On screen was a view of a hallway in the underground base of Chimera. Two security guards were walking down the hall. One had Roman and Remus in her arms, and the other was holding Virgil off the ground as they walked down the corridor. Patton hoped they were taking them to Janus's office. He was lucky Janus didn't kill kids. Sucks that the boss don't have cams in his office, Andy remarked as she turned her laptop back around. He's got his computer camera covered and his microphone removed. Smart guy. If you ever need to check up on them, I can probably get into their cell phones if you gave me their numbers. Thank you so much, Patton said. I owe you. Andy waved a hand dismissively. Nah, it's good. I got enough money from running other gigs. Remy shoved his hands into his pockets. Now, the fake identities? Yeah, I got you. Andy grabbed a handful of chips from the bag, but she stopped before she could stuff them in her mouth. She looked up at the ceiling. God damn it. Remy furrowed his brow. What? What's wrong? Then Patton heard it. Footsteps walked around above them, and then he heard them jogging down the staircase that led into the living room. Patton stared at the stairs like a deer in headlights as someone's pajama-clad legs came into view. A man emerged from the stairwell, rubbing his eyes sleepily. He opened them and they widened. What the fuck? He shrieked in alarm at the sight of the people in his living room. He stumbled backwards and fell onto the landing. His brown hair was disheveled and his robe was rumpled as if he'd just woken up. He stared back and forth between all three people before him. I forgot he was home. Andy gestured to the man with one hand. Remy Domire, Patton Hart. This is Thomas Sanders. I broke into his house. Chapter 7. I already don't like the Snake Man. Janus didn't quite know what to do about the kids. DW left to get them some water from the staff room, leaving the four of them alone in Janus's office. The three kids stood near the door, the purple-haired teenager stationed a little in front of the other two as if to protect them. He glared at Janus, gripping the straps of his backpack tight. The two twins peeked out at Janus from behind the older one, staring with curiosity at the pale blotches on the left side of his face. They must have been Patton's kids. Physically, they looked nothing like him, but everything else screamed Hart. The teenager had that same vigilance Patton always used to display, standing with his feet shoulder-width apart and gaze flickering all around the room as if searching for something that could be used as a weapon. No doubt Patton had taught the kids some self-defense. The younger kids, however, looked more excited and curious than afraid. The odd gleam in their eyes was the same one that Patton would always get when he saw something interesting or beautiful. Janus gestured to the couches. "You may sit down, if you like. I'm sure your journey here has been taxing." The teenager narrowed his eyes further. Janus couldn't help the pang of nostalgia he got at the sight. It was the same look Patton had given him upon their first meeting. How things had changed since then. The other two, however, rushed over to a couch without hesitation. The one in the red shirt leaped onto the cushions with an excited squeal. The other one simply flopped onto the couch and immediately grabbed at one of the soft blankets. The teenager glanced from Janus to the twins. He turned his glare back to Janus and lowered himself onto one of the cushions. Janus leaned back against his desk. The door swung open and DW walked in with a stack of cups and a pitcher of water. She set them on the coffee table and straightened. She motioned to the armchair with her head. "Come on, Jan." DW sat on the armchair and leaned back, arms and legs crossed. Janus sat on the arm of the chair and looked down at the three children. The twin in green with the bleached streak in his hair had slid off the couch and sat in front of the coffee table to carefully pour himself a cup of water. He finished pouring, and instead of drinking it himself, he held the cup out to his twin. The boy in red muttered a thank you under his breath and took the cup. The green twin poured another cup and held it up to the teenager. The teen's eyes widened slightly, but he just smiled and shook his head with a quiet, "No thanks." The green twin shrugged and sipped at the water himself. "So," Janus began, "do you all have names?"
"I'm Remus,"
the twin in green blurted. He pointed to his twin.
"That's Roman."
Janus raised an eyebrow at the teenager. "And you are?" The teenager scowled. "You don't need to know." Roman pointed at the teenager.
"That's Virgil."
"Virgil," Janus repeated. That was a name he'd never heard before. "It's nice to meet all of you, I suppose. I assume you are Patton's children?" "Yes," Virgil snapped. He didn't lower his glare from Janus's face, but his gaze never met Janus's eyes. "So, do you happen to know why Patton Hart sent a bunch of children to us? Children who should be in school from the looks of it," Janus added, giving their backpacks a quick glance. Virgil reached into the pocket of his black and purple sweater. He pulled out an envelope with Janus's name written on it in Patton's handwriting. He tossed it like a frisbee towards the armchair. DW caught it in one hand and held it up to Janus. Her gaze didn't move from the teenager's face. Janus took the envelope and tore it open. Out of the envelope came 3 folded pieces of paper. Janus tucked the envelope under his arm and unfolded the papers. He scanned the paragraphs scribbled messily on the pages. "Janus, I'm cashing in that favor. Take care of them for me. You don't even have to do it yourself. You can hire a nanny or just let Virgil do everything. Doesn't matter. But they need to be under your direct eye. Keep them with you at all times. Don't let Wrath anywhere near them. Don't let them out of your sight if you can help it. Just keep them safe for me. If anyone finds out you have them, make sure people know you're the one caring for them. Make threats, up your security, I don't care. Do anything you can within your power to make sure my kiddos stay alive and safe. I'm counting on you. Best wishes, Patton." Janus read the letter once, then again to let it fully register in his brain. He tucked the letter behind the other 2 pieces of paper that had been in the envelope. On one page was a couple paragraphs about each of the kids. Tips on how to care for them, Janus assumed. On the final paper was a list of phone numbers and who the numbers belonged to. Janus swallowed. So, the day had come. Wrath's blade had found Patton. He knew it would happen eventually. No one escapes Wrath. He just wasn't prepared for it to happen now, and he certainly wasn't prepared to babysit a bunch of kids. He cleared his throat and lowered the letter. "It appears that I am to become your temporary caretaker for the time your father is gone. I will admit that I am ill-equipped for this, but I will do my best to keep you safe as promised." He gently folded the papers and tucked them back into the envelope. DW looked up at him with an incredulous look. "Wait, we're supposed to babysit them?" "Yes." Janus stood. "For the time being, at least. Don't worry, they're not spies for Wrath's blade. They are children of an old friend." He gave her a look that he hoped conveyed his point. DW blinked. She stood from the armchair and jabbed her thumb in the direction of the door. "Janny, can we talk in private for a minute?" Janus slid the envelope into the jacket of his suit. "Oh, absolutely not, DW. I'm sure these children need us to watch them at all times." "Great." She strode to the door and Janus followed. "Don't break anything," he called to the 3 kids as he left the room. He shut the door behind him. DW whirled on him the moment the doors closed. Since when does Patton Hart have kids? Janus sighed. We knew this was going to happen eventually. Sure, I didn't expect children to be a part of it, but Patton needs us now. I still don't know if we can trust him, DW argued. She rubbed at her hip where her leg met her prosthetic. The guy is a fucking maniac, Jan. Sure, he's changed, but who's to say he's any more trustworthy now? Remember what happened when we ran into him in 2010? Janus shuddered. Please don't remind me. The Poison Dart Massacre was a nightmare. He sighed. But this is a little more complicated than a normal babysitting gig. I know you don't trust them, or Patton for that matter, but these are kids. They're probably scared. They've been running from Wrath all day. DW's shoulders slumped. We're all gonna be on Wrath's shit list if we keep meddling in their stuff like this. Janus shrugged. You seemed pretty eager to help these same children earlier when you went out to get coffee. She narrowed her eyes. I hate it when you have a point. She rubbed the bridge of her nose with 2 fingers, like a headache was sprouting behind her eyes. We keeping him at the house or here? Well, Patton did say in his letter that I should keep them in my sight at all times if I can. I suppose we'll have to make up the guest rooms in the house. DW shot a glance back at the door. Do you even know how to take care of kids? I'm sure it won't be difficult. How hard could watching over a few children be? Virgil wanted to make this guy's life a living hell. As soon as Mr. Chimera and his bodyguard, girlfriend, secretary left the room, Roman and Remus started taking all the blankets and throw pillows and piling them into a pillow fort. Virgil was almost tempted to tell them to stop when Remus started removing the cushions from the couch, but he decided not to. Whatever made this Janus Chimera guy's life more difficult was something Virgil could support. He just didn't trust this dude. How did he know Patton? Why hadn't Dad ever told them about Janus Chimera before? And what was with the stuff he overheard those people talking about in that room in one of the hallways? This whole place was shady as hell, and he didn't like it one bit. The door opened, and Mr. Chimera and his friend walked back in. Janus's gaze flickered to the pillow fort being constructed in his office. Annoyance flashed across his face, but he said nothing about it. He cleared his throat to get the twins' attention. He gestured to the woman standing next to him. This is DW. If you need anything urgent, speak to her. You will remain here until the end of the day, when it is time for me to go home. You will live with me there, and travel with me here during work days, so I can do my job and keep an eye on you at the same time. You can stay in my office during the day, and I will take you to the staff room for lunch when the time comes. Do you have snacks? Mr. Chimera blinked at Virgil. Pardon? Do you have snacks? Virgil repeated firmly. He crossed his arms. We always have a snack at 3. I don't like changing up our schedule. Mr. Chimera nodded. Fair. Yes, we do have snacks in the staff room. DW can take you to it. On the topic of schedules, I do have my own to stick to, so please refrain from interrupting me too much. He strode to his desk. The woman, DW, turned and left the room, leaving the door open a crack. Virgil turned back to Roman and Remus. They were busy trying to prop up a cushion against the coffee table so they could drape a blanket over the whole thing. Virgil heard the clacking of computer keys as Janus started typing something on his computer. Virgil shouldered his backpack and leaned back in his seat, already getting lost in his boredom, despite the anxiety that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. There didn't seem to be anything to do in here. He didn't want to use up all the battery on his phone, and he didn't bring any books to read. He stood and walked to the door with a sigh. Roman and Remus could handle themselves in here on their own. They seemed preoccupied with their pillow fort anyways. He nudged the door open and kicked it shut behind him. He walked past DW's desk towards the door across her office. It couldn't hurt to wander the place a little, could it? They were under Mr. Chimera's protection now. No one was going to mess with him in here, would they? Where are you going, kid? Virgil turned around to look at DW sitting at her desk. Gonna look around, he answered. Is that allowed? DW nodded. Yes, just hang on. She opened a drawer in her desk and rummaged around. She plucked something from her desk and tossed it to him. Just in case. Virgil fumbled with it and it almost fell to the ground. He managed not to drop it and he stared down at the thing DW had thrown him. It was a black pin with the Chimera logo on it, a bright yellow 2-headed snake. It'll let everyone know you're authorized to be here, DW said. She gave him a small smile. I hope you know that you're safe here. If anyone gives you any problems, come talk to me. I'll knock some sense into them. Virgil stared at her. He thought she'd been annoyed by Virgil's sudden presence here. Thank you, he said. Stay safe, hon. She turned back to the computer on the desk in front of her. Virgil stuck the pin through his shirt. He straightened his sweater to make sure the pin was visible. He glanced towards the door, but now he wondered if exploring really was the best idea. What if he bumped into someone in a hallway and they asked why he was there? What if he got lost and had to ask someone 4 directions? What if? So many scenarios rolled through his head. He already had a stressful enough day, and it was only past noon. He shouldn't make things worse by purposely going out and interacting with people he didn't know. But he didn't want to stay here and be a bother to Mr. Chimera and his friend. You okay, kid? Virgil looked up. DW was staring at him with one eyebrow raised. It took him a moment to realize he was chewing on his bat necklace. He took it out of his mouth, face flushing with embarrassment. Yeah, I'm good. DW gestured to the couch across the room. You can stay here if you want. I don't mind a little company. I've got books you can read, too. Virgil hesitated. He didn't want to be a bother. I don't know, he muttered. I can just go if I'm... You're not bugging me, DW assured him. You can stay here. I get it. I don't always want to be in the same room as Jack the Fibber in there. She pointedly jerked her head towards the door to Mr. Chimera's office. Virgil glanced from Janus's door to the couch. Are you sure? Absolutely, DW said. Go ahead, kid. Get comfortable. She turned back to her computer. Virgil raised his bat necklace back to his mouth. He couldn't help but wonder if she was lying about him not being a bother, but he decided that saying anything more about it would just be bothering her more. He trudged over to the couch and sat, feeling a little awkward. He glanced at the short bookshelf next to the couch. He spotted a couple familiar titles, but he didn't want to disturb her things. He glanced up at her. She seemed absorbed in her work now. She might not notice if he read a book or two. He scooted closer to the bookshelf and peered at the titles. He spotted Fahrenheit 451 on the shelf and reached for it, tugging it out of the mess of books and flipping it open. He'd read it before with Dad and Mr. Minder, but it was a good book, so he might as well read it again. For the first time all day, he sat back and let himself relax, just a touch. Just for now. Chapter 8. Oh God, I made an 11-year-old cry. Remy lowered his sunglasses to stare at Andy. You broke into someone's house? Andy shrugged. I'm unpredictable like that. She shoved another handful of chips into her mouth. Patton turned to the man, Thomas, who was still staring at them like they were ghosts. We're sorry for breaking in like this, Patton blurted. We didn't know this wasn't Andy's house. We'll leave. He grabbed Remy's sleeve and tugged him towards the door. Come on, you two. Thomas Sanders blinked at them. His shocked expression morphed into one of exasperation. He heaved a great sigh and pushed himself to his feet. Andy, I've changed the locks 5 times. How do you keep getting in? I'm special, Andy said through a mouthful of chips. Thomas shook his head and turned to Patton and Remy. Sorry, you're welcome to stay. He gestured to Andy with one hand. Andy comes in here a lot. I'm used to it. I just wish you would give me some warning beforehand, because I am not prepared for company. He shot Andy a glare as he straightened his robe. He gave Patton and Remy an apologetic smile. This isn't the first time I've had unexpected guests. Feel free to sit and get comfortable. Remy didn't hesitate to flop on the couch next to Andy. Patton, however, wanted to make sure he wasn't intruding too much. Are you sure? He asked. We can leave if you... Thomas waved a hand. It's fine. Seriously, don't worry about it. It's not the first time I've taken in strangers. He folded his robe over his shirt and strode to the kitchen. I'll get you some late lunch. Patton raised an eyebrow, and his suspicions rose with it. This is a normal occurrence for you? If this guy was involved with Andy, who was involved in illegal things and might have worked with Wrath before in the past, who was to say Patton could trust him? This Thomas guy seemed perfectly fine, but Patton couldn't be too cautious in a situation like this. Thomas opened the cupboard and rummaged through it. Yeah, Andy brings people here all the time. Sometimes I wake up and she's sitting at the end of my bed like a sleep paralysis demon. It's nothing I haven't dealt with before. He pulled a jar of peanut butter out of his cupboard. Is anyone okay with PB&J for lunch? We don't need anything, Remy said. He lowered his sunglasses and twisted around in his seat to face Thomas. He gave Thomas a once-over and a grin twitched at his lips. There's a good enough snack standing right in front of me. Patton swatted Remy on the arm. Remy! He ignored the blush on Thomas's face that appeared at the compliment. I'm sorry about him. He flirts with anything that moves. It's all right, Thomas said, his voice an octave higher. He cleared his throat and put the peanut butter back into the cupboard. So, what kind of stuff are you guys involved in? Patton didn't want to answer, especially since he didn't know this guy, but Remy piped up before he could say no. Running from Wrath's blade, counting on Chimera to keep Pat's kids safe. You know how it goes. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Damn. Well, I don't know exactly how you ended up in this situation, but you can stay here for as long as you need. Andy set up signal jammers here a long time ago. No one can track you. Patton took a deep breath. Look, I'm sorry for being so paranoid, but I need to be cautious because Wrath is trying to track me down. How do I know I can trust you? Thomas leaned against the counter and looked Patton dead in the eye. Do you want the short explanation or the long explanation? Whichever one makes you happy, babe, Remy said, smirking at Thomas. Andy snorted and shoved more chips into her mouth. Thomas cleared his throat and looked at the ground. Short explanation it is. He rolled up the sleeve of his robe and held out his forearm for Patton and Remy to see. Remy lowered his sunglasses again. Damn, Andy, you didn't tell me your hot friend was a bad boy with tattoos. Wrapped around Thomas's forearm was a tattoo of a bright yellow snake with 2 heads. One head looked as if it was lunging out of his skin with its fangs bared. The tail of the snake twisted around and rested on the back of his hand. He lowered his sleeve. I used to help Chimera protect victims Wrath was targeting. I'm not with them anymore, but I'm not going to sell you out to Wrath. Patton raised a hand and scratched his left shoulder as he stared at Thomas's arm. Okay, he said finally. He lowered himself onto the couch next to Remy, nails still scratching his shoulder through the denim. I guess we can stay. For now. Works for me, Remy said, his gaze fixed on Thomas. Thomas avoided Remy's gaze, and his face flushed. I'll go make up a guest bedroom. Andy, if you're staying, you're sleeping on the couch. Andy gave Thomas a thumbs up. Thomas turned and jogged up the stairs. He's cute, Remy said as soon as Thomas was out of earshot. He looked at Andy. Andy, I have 2 questions. Andy shrugged. Shoot. 1, is Thomas gay? And 2, is Thomas single? Yes and yes, Andy said through a mouthful of chips. Go get him, Tiger. Remy went to stand up, but Patton grabbed his sleeve and pulled him back down onto the couch. No, you are not flirting with the man who's keeping us safe. Remy deflated like a balloon. But why not? Because we're running from a super dangerous gang and we can't afford to make attachments, especially not with someone we just met. We don't know if we can trust him yet. And I know that's super hypocritical of me to say, considering I will get emotionally attached to a butterfly if it lands on my hand for less than a minute, but seriously, Remy, this is dangerous and scary. Remy sighed. Pat, I hate to break it to you, but you need to loosen up. I know our lives are in danger, but you can relax here. You trust me, I trust Andy, and Andy trusts Thomas, so I think we can trust him too. Besides, he used to work with Chimera. Chimera's better than Wrath, more or less. This guy can help us if you let him. Patton gripped his shoulder, digging his nails through the denim jacket. Remy was right. As much as Patton couldn't afford to trust everyone he came across, he couldn't afford to trust no one at all. If Andy and Thomas could keep him safe and figure out how to throw Wrath off his trail, maybe it would be worth it to stay for a bit. He leaned back on the couch. He may have been safe for now. He could only hope the same for his kiddos. Janus still had no idea what to do about the children in his office. The twins weren't too disruptive. They simply messed up all his couches to make a pillow fort and continued to do so for the next 15 minutes. They were a little louder than Janus would have liked, but he said nothing about it and tried to focus on his work. It wasn't too difficult to ignore them and keep sending emails and calls. Things got a little louder when the kids opened their backpacks and started playing with some toys they'd brought along, but Janus figured he could bear it. However, it was much harder to stay focused with the kids shouting about robots and princes and cars and a variety of other things that Janus didn't particularly care about. He stared at his computer screen, trying to come up with words to write so he could assign someone to kidnap a specific person who hadn't yet repaid their debts, but his thoughts were constantly interrupted by the 2 twins squealing at each other and laughing. He wished they would be quieter. It was impossible for him to work like this. Was this what it was like to have kids all the time? One of them screamed happily, and Janus clenched his fists in annoyance. Can you be quiet? He snapped. The squealing and shouting stopped as if someone had pressed a mute button on a TV. He glanced up past his screen and saw the 2 kids staring at him. The one in the red shirt, Roman, hunched his shoulders and disappeared into the pillow fort they'd made. The other one, Remus, narrowed his eyes at Janus. He crawled into the fort after his brother. Janus took a deep breath. At least now it was quiet. He kept working. The only sounds he heard were the hushed whispers of the kids in their fort. Well, it was better than the screeching and yelling, at least. He paused in his work when he heard a different sound. One of the kids took a shaky breath. Was the kid crying? Janus blinked at the fort. He stood and quietly walked over to it, a little curious. He leaned down and brushed a blanket aside to look in. The twins sat on a mess of blankets. Roman was huddled into Remus's side, tears streaming down his face. Remus whipped his head up to glare at Janus with a fury that Janus didn't think an 11-year-old was capable of. You made him upset, Remus said. Janus straightened, staring down at the kids in confusion. Goodness, he'd never had to deal with crying children before. Was the purple-haired teenager still around to fix this? He let the blanket go so it covered the entrance to the fort. He turned on his heel and walked to the door, hoping that Virgil kid was still nearby. He gently nudged the door open and peered into DW's office. "Purple kid, are you in here?" His gaze fell on the emo teenager sitting on the couch at the other end of DW's office. Both he and DW looked up when Janus stepped into the room. "The red one is crying," he said to Virgil. "How do I get him to stop?" Virgil lowered the book he was reading. "What the hell did you do?" "Nothing at all," Janus said. "I simply asked them if they could be quieter." Virgil set the book down and stormed towards Janus and the door. "You can't just yell at them. Roman's sensitive." He pushed Janus aside and entered his office. Janus turned to stare at the kid. "I did not yell at them. I didn't even raise my voice." Virgil ignored him and crouched down next to the blanket fort. He disappeared into the mess of blankets and pillows. Janus turned to DW with an incredulous look on his face. "What did I do?" DW shrugged. "Some kids are sensitive. You have to be careful with them." Janus sighed in exasperation. "I can't keep track of their feelings, Dorothy. I'm busy working. How was I supposed to know the kid would cry if I asked him to quiet down?" "How did you phrase it when you asked?" "I just said, 'Can you be quiet?'" Janus scoffed. "I didn't think that would end up in crying." "What about your tone?" Janus opened his mouth to respond, but his words got caught in his throat. "Oh," he said instead, his voice quiet. "I suppose I was a little snippy." He never usually paid attention to how things might sound when he said them. He shouldn't have been surprised that he accidentally snapped at the kids. "Great, now I'm an asshole," he muttered. "What time is it? I want this day to be over so we can go home." 3:00, DW answered. Janus removed his hat for a moment to run a hand through his hair. This day was crawling along at an incredibly slow pace. He wanted nothing more than to go home, have dinner, take a hot bath, and crawl into bed. But instead, he was stuck with a bunch of children. DW turned in her chair so she was facing him. "Look, I'll help you take care of them. I don't really know shit about kids either, but you're gonna need someone else to help you." A little bit of relief washed over Janus when she said that. "I don't know what I would do without you, Dorothy." She shrugged and twisted her chair back to look at her computer. "You'd probably be dead by now." "You're not wrong about that." He straightened his hat. "I suppose I should monitor my tone when speaking to the children from now on. Thank you for pointing that out, TW." He walked back towards his office. He paused when he passed the blanket fort, wondering if he should try to speak, maybe utter a quick apology, or offer them help with anything they might need. But they seemed occupied in a quiet conversation amongst themselves, so he chose not to intervene. They could sort things out themselves. He continued to his desk and sat down, ready to get back to work. He started typing out the email he'd been in the middle of writing when he was interrupted by the kids and their childish dilemma. However, speaking of the kids, Patton had said to keep them as safe as possible. Being here with dozens of hitmen who could accidentally shoot the kids when startled might not be the best idea. Perhaps Janus and DW could work from home from now on, or at least limit their time in the office. But only until Patton returned to get his little rugrats off Janus's hands. He didn't think he could stay out of the office for too long. Janus opened his desk drawer and grabbed one of his many unused flash drives. He plugged it into his computer and proceeded to copy all of his important files to it. If he was going to be more absent for the next who knows how long, he would have to get someone to temporarily stand in for him. He would notify everyone that they could call or email him at any point if needed, but he needed someone present in his and DW's place to solve smaller problems that didn't warrant a phone call. The door swung open. DW sauntered into the room with a large bag of chips and a package of cookies in her hands. She stopped in front of the pillow fort and nudged a blanket aside with her foot. She leaned down to place the bag of chips inside. "You said you had snacks at 3, she said. "If you don't want those, I can get you something else." The hushed voices from inside the fort stopped. "Thank you," said a voice so quiet Janus couldn't hear who it was that spoke. DW let the blanket swing back over the entrance. She turned and walked towards Janus. "You're eating something," she ordered as she set the package of cookies on his desk. "No buts." Janus looked from the cookies to DW's face. He didn't have time to snack. He was busy. However, he knew she wouldn't stop bugging him until he actually ate. He sighed and reached into the package to grab a cookie. "Fine. By the way, I am thinking we should limit our time here for the children's sake. I don't want them running into any hitmen and getting punched in the face for it. I was thinking we should only spend mornings here from 9 to 12, and then return home. Does that sound like a suitable plan?" DW just smiled, obviously satisfied at the fact that she had gotten him to agree to eat something. "Whatever works for you, Jan." She turned on her heel and walked to the door. "Enjoy your snacks." With that, she left his office and shut the door behind her. Janus dejectedly bit into a cookie. He didn't like random factors throwing a metaphorical wrench into his schedule, and these kids were like a whole toolbox being tossed into his life. He knew next to nothing about kids, let alone teenagers. He glanced up at the blanket fort. tiny bit of guilt settled into his gut. Maybe an apology for making one of them cry wouldn't be a bad thing. He took a deep breath and stood, trying to figure out what to say. As an afterthought, he grabbed the package of cookies in one hand. Children liked cookies, didn't they? That might help smooth some ruffled feathers. He walked across the room and stopped in front of the fort. He used one hand to lift the blanket out of the way, crouching down so he was on their level. The teenager glared at him from within the blankets, the red twin huddled into his side. "You've done enough," he growled. The green twin crossed his arms and narrowed his eyes in a crude imitation of his older brother's glower. Oddly enough, the 11-year-old's glare was almost scarier with the sheer amount of rage he was radiating. Virgil looked like his anger had settled into distaste and annoyance, but Remus looked like he could and would attack Janus as soon as his brother gave the word. Janus suppressed a sigh. "Look, Roman, was it?" The twin in the red shirt peeked out of Virgil's hoodie fabric for a moment to look at Janus with a tear-streaked face. Janus had hardly ever seen a child cry in his life, but the sight was truly, well, pitiful might be the best word to describe it, and sad. He cleared his throat. "It has come to my attention that I snapped at you earlier. My intentions were never to cause you distress, but since that was the result, I apologize." He offered the open package of cookies out to them. "Perhaps a few cookies might make up for it?" Roman blinked. He looked from Virgil to Remus to the cookie package to Janus. He scooted out of Virgil's embrace and reached for the package. He grabbed 3 cookies in his hand. With a shy glance at Janus's face, he started munching on a cookie. "Thank you," he mumbled through a mouthful of cookie. Janus couldn't help the small smile that appeared on his face. He offered the package to Remus. "You can have some as well." Remus's eyes widened. His anger faded into suspicious curiosity. He glanced from Janus's face to the package of cookies. Janus flinched as Remus lunged for the cookies and snatched a few in his hands at a speed he didn't think the kid was capable of. Clutching his delicious prize in his hands, he scurried off further into the fort like a deranged raccoon after looting a garbage can. Janus blinked. He shook off his surprise and turned to Virgil, offering the cookies to him. Virgil just glared in response. Janus shrugged. "All right, I'll set them on the coffee table if you want any." Janus retreated from the fort and straightened. He took a couple more cookies from the package to snack on and set the rest on the coffee table that was currently covered with a blanket. Over the course of the next couple hours, the kids played in their fort as Janus worked. He emailed one of the higher-ranking agents, Moggy Sailor, and told her that she would be in charge of answering questions and such while Janus was away from the office. DW stopped in a few times, once with a book to give to Virgil that he had been reading prior to entering Janus's office. Throughout that time, the twins kept their volume lower, so not to disturb Janus, which he was grateful for. Occasionally, they left the fort to grab cookies from the package Janus left him. The package was empty within an hour. To Janus's knowledge, Virgil hadn't eaten a single one. Thank you all so much for listening. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this series. If you like what you hear and you want to read more, you can find the link to the fic and the author in the description. If you want to check out other podfics I've done, you can click on the playlist linked on the screen. See you next time.